The first snicker came from behind a glass partition, quiet enough to pretend it hadn't happened, loud enough to follow Reid Sorensen across the entire waiting room. He heard it the moment the elevator opened onto the 32nd floor of Caldwell-Brent Capital in downtown Toronto. 14 candidates sat in ergonomic chairs along a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Ontario flat and gray behind them in the February light. Every one of them wore something that cost more than Reid's monthly rent. Structured blazers, slim-cut trousers, leather folios that still smelled like the store. Reid wore his good jacket, the navy one he'd dry-cleaned twice in 3 years, and carried a canvas messenger bag with a fraying strap that his son Leo had taped up the previous morning using green electrical tape because they'd run out of the brown kind. He noticed the snicker's origin without looking. A cluster of 3 men near the reception desk, early 30s, the kind of confident that came from never having had a reason to doubt themselves. One of them glanced at Reid's bag and said something low to the others. The other 2 smiled into their coffees. Reid signed the check-in sheet and found a seat near the window. He didn't look at them again. He was already reading the room. 14 candidates. 2 assessors visible behind the glass office at the far end. 1 security camera above the reception desk with a sluggish sweep arc. Maybe 8 seconds of blind angle every rotation. The firm's internal financial review files, 3 of them, were visible on an open workstation that nobody had thought to lock before stepping away. 2 junior associates moved through the space with that particular urgency of people performing busyness for an audience. And on the wall monitor cycling through the firm's quarterly performance slides, a single line in a footnote on slide 7 that didn't match the revenue figures on slide 3 by a margin large enough to mean one of 2 things. Either a typo that would embarrass someone or a discrepancy that someone was hoping nobody would read carefully enough to notice. Reid noticed it in the first 40 seconds. He didn't write it down, he filed it. Sorensen? A woman in a charcoal blazer appeared in the doorway. We're starting the first assessment round in the boardroom. See candidates with CPA designation. Please follow me. Reid stood. The man who'd smirked earlier looked up from his folio, then at Reid, then back down with a faint expression that managed to convey pity and amusement simultaneously. You have your CPA? He asked, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Former FinTrack analyst, Reid said. Federal designation, they let me in anyway. He followed the woman down the hall before the man could respond. Boardroom C had a long maple table, a projection screen, and 7 chairs on each side. The candidates filed in. Donna Fisk, Caldwell-Brent's senior audit partner, stood at the head of the table reviewing notes on a tablet. She was precise in the way that certain professionals became over decades. Efficient gestures, economic with warmth. Somebody who had learned that sentiment cost time. She looked up once as the candidates settled, cataloged them the way Reid had cataloged the room, and Reid watched her expression pause fractionally when it reached him, the same small recalibration he'd seen in hiring managers for 4 years running. We'll spend the first 40 minutes on a live case file review, Donna said. Firm client materials, numbers adjusted for confidentiality. You'll be assessed on depth of analysis, not speed. Accuracy matters more than volume. Questions before we begin? Nobody asked any. Donna pulled the case file onto the projection screen. Reid opened his copy and read the first page in the time it took other candidates to uncap their pens. He was on page 4 when the fire alarm did not go off, but should have because what happened next was its own kind of emergency dressed in silence. The workstation monitor on the south wall, the same open terminal Reid had noted from the waiting room, flickered. Then the firm's internal review dashboard, partially visible through the glass partition behind Donna's shoulder, shifted. Someone was accessing the document archive, live. During a hiring assessment, with what appeared to be an executive-level credential, because the access level shown in the corner of the screen required clearance that only 4 people in the firm possessed. Reid stopped writing. Most people only noticed change when it was loud. Reid had spent 6 years at the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada, learning to notice change when it was deliberate and quiet. The difference between someone pulling a file and someone erasing a file was small on a monitor across the room, but it wasn't invisible. He raised his hand. Donna looked up with the expression of someone who expected a procedural question. Yes? Your archive server is being accessed right now from inside the building, Reid said, keeping his voice level, and based on the file path visible on that terminal, whatever's being pulled isn't being opened. It's being deleted. Silence hit the boardroom. One candidate actually laughed, nervous and disbelieving. Another looked at Reid the way people look at someone who has said something embarrassing in a quiet restaurant. Donna did not laugh. She turned toward the terminal and looked, and the expression that crossed her face in the next 3 seconds told Reid everything he needed to know. She saw it too, and she recognized what it meant, and it frightened her in a way that the hiring assessment never would. She pressed the intercom on the table, security to server level, non-drill. Two things happened simultaneously. The candidates started talking over each other, and Reid was already moving toward the door. "Mr. Sorensen," Donna said sharply. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "The access credential being used belongs to your CFO level or above. You have 3 people with that clearance on site today. I saw the staff board in the lobby. One of them is doing something they don't want on record." He paused. "The files being erased are from 4 years ago." Donna's eyes changed. "How do you know that?" "Because 4 years ago I flagged the same file path to a federal review board and was fired from my position within 11 days of doing it." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I'd like to help you stop whoever's finishing the job." The boardroom stayed suspended in that specific silence that precedes a decision that can't be undone. Then Donna said quietly, "Come with me." The firm's server infrastructure occupied a climate-controlled room on the 29th floor. Accessible through a stairwell most employees didn't know existed because it was designed for IT personnel and fire inspectors. Donna moved fast for someone in heels. Reid matched her pace, and neither of them spoke on the stairs because the kind of conversation they were about to have required walls that weren't moving. On the 29th floor, a security officer stood outside the server room door, looking uncertain. The expression of someone who had received an alert they didn't know how to categorize. Donna keyed the door open. Inside, rows of humming server racks, blue indicator lights, the particular cold of rooms that existed to keep machines comfortable. And at the terminal in the far corner, a man Reid had never seen in person, but whose photograph he had looked at more times than he could count over the past 4 years. Gareth Pinder, Chief Financial Officer of Caldwell-Brent Capital, turned from the terminal with the measured calm of someone who had prepared for this moment and decided composure was the only currency worth spending. "Donna," he said, "I was just running a routine archive integrity check." "With deletion commands active," Reid said. Gareth looked at Reid with the particular attention of someone identifying a variable they hadn't anticipated. "You are?" "A candidate for your internal audit vacancy." Reid kept his hands easy at his sides. "Also the person who submitted file reference FC 2019-0047 to Fintrack's Enforcement Division, sealed under a non-disclosure protocol and used to remove me from federal service." He let the number sit. "Same file path you're currently deleting." Gareth's face didn't break, but something behind it recalculated. "That file was closed, reviewed, cleared, closed." "I know. I also know it was cleared by a reviewing officer who had a consulting contract with one of your shell subsidiaries." Reid had said this sentence in his head hundreds of times. It sounded different out loud in a cold server room with the actual person in front of him. "What I didn't know until about 6 minutes ago was that someone accessed the physical audit records related to that file 3 years ago. From outside the firm, a contracted external auditor." Donna looked between them. "What external auditor?" Reid's jaw held for a moment before answering. "Her name was Catherine Sorensen, my wife." He kept his voice flat the way he'd taught himself to. "She died in a highway collision outside of Barrie, January, 3 years ago. Black ice." That's what the report said. The server room hummed. Gareth's composure did something small and irreversible in that moment. Not guilt. Men like Gareth didn't arrive at guilt easily, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understood that the geometry of a situation had shifted irrevocably and that the next words out of his mouth would be load-bearing. He chose wrong ones. "You can't substantiate any connection," he said. "You have a grievance and a theory. This firm has lawyers. This firm also has a live deletion log running right now that your own security system is recording," Reid said, "including the timestamp, the credential used, and the file identifiers." He glanced at the blinking indicator light on the terminal Gareth had been using. "Your integrity audit system doesn't stop recording when you delete files. It records the deletion." Donna was already on her phone. Gareth moved, not toward the door, but toward the terminal, one fast step, hand reaching for the keyboard. Reid stepped in front of him without urgency, one arm across the rack, not aggressive, just present. Gareth was taller. It didn't help him. Reid had spent 2 years before Fintrack working protective detail for federal witnesses in situations where the danger wore a suit and arrived with a briefcase, and the body remembered what the mind sometimes tried to forget. "Don't," Reid said quietly. Gareth stopped. Not because of the word, but because of the absolute absence of anger in it. Anger could be pushed through. This was something different. This was a man who had already decided exactly how far he would go and had made peace with it. Security arrived 40 seconds later, then Donna's general counsel on the phone, then Audra Mackenzie, CEO of Caldwell-Brent, who came down the stairs in the kind of controlled urgency that meant she'd been briefed mid-sentence and processed it faster than most people, process a full briefing. She looked at Gareth, she looked at the terminal, she looked at Reid. "Who are you?" she asked. Donna answered before Reid could. The only person in this building who read slide 7 before the assessment started. Reid's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Leo, third time in 40 minutes. Audra noticed. "Take it." He stepped to the far side of the server rack and answered. "Dad." Leo's voice carried that specific register children used when they were being patient about something they didn't feel patient about. "Mrs. Oliphant says I can stay for the science fair setup, but only if you say so before 3:30. Reid checked his watch, 3:22. "Have you eaten anything since lunch?" he asked. "Half a granola bar." "That doesn't count." "I know." The other half fell on the floor. Something in Reid's chest loosened precisely 1 degree, the way it always did when Leo was within earshot. "You can stay. I'll be there by 5. A pause, then quieter. "Did the interview go okay? You sound like your concentrating voice." "Still happening," Reid said. "Is it a good still happening or a complicated still happening?" He looked through the gap between server racks at Gareth Pinder sitting with Donna's general counsel now, at Audra Mackenzie standing with her arms folded reading the deletion log on a tablet, at the blue indicator lights blinking in their patient rows. "Complicated," he said, "but I think okay." Leo considered this. Gran always said complicated things that turn out okay are the ones worth remembering. Reid stayed quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "she did." He ended the call and walked back. The next 2 hours unspooled the way these things did once the architecture of a cover-up began to be visible. Methodically, without drama, with the particular bureaucratic weight of institutions realizing they had been wrong for a long time and needing to document it carefully. Audra's legal team pulled the deletion log. External forensics were called. The shell subsidiary connections that Reid had mapped in his head over 4 years of evenings at the kitchen table after Leo was asleep came out on paper one by one, each one confirming what he'd already known and never been able to prove quickly enough. Gareth did not confess. Men like Gareth rarely did in the room. They waited for their lawyers and constructed alternative narratives, and sometimes succeeded. But the deletion log was clean and time-stamped, and his credential was the only one active in that window, and at a certain point the alternative narrative required more explanation than the straightforward one. What came after was harder. Donna brought Reid a coffee he hadn't asked for and sat across from him in a small meeting room while the lawyers continued down the hall. Catherine Sorensen submitted a preliminary findings memo to our external audit board in November 3 years ago, she said. "I found it in a subfolder our general counsel didn't know existed." She slid a printed page across the table. "She flagged the same discrepancy you flagged at Fintrack. She was thorough. She was right." Reid looked at the memo. Catherine's formatting. Her habit of bolding the most important number in each paragraph so it couldn't be missed. He'd forgotten about that habit until seeing it again made it completely impossible to forget. "She was driving back from a client meeting in Barrie," Donna said carefully, 3 weeks after submitting this. Reid didn't need the implication spelled out. He sat with it for a moment the way you sat with something heavy that you had always suspected was there. And that being right about it didn't make lighter. It just made it real in a different way. "I need to know," he said, "whether that memo changed anything before she died, whether anyone acted on it." Donna's expression answered before her words did. It was filed and not escalated. Gareth chaired the Audit Oversight Committee at that time. Reid was quiet. He thought about the 17 months after Catherine died when he'd barely slept properly, when Leo had been 7 years old and had taken to leaving small drawings on Reid's pillow because he'd read somewhere that pictures helped when words didn't. He thought about the morning he'd sat at the kitchen table with a coffee gone cold and looked at his Fintrack termination letter, and understood for the first time that the thing he'd been fighting wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It had been deliberate, it had been organized, and he had lost. He had thought, sitting at that table, that he would never stop being angry. What he'd actually done was become very quiet and very precise and very patient. "You applied for this position 8 days ago," Audra said from the doorway. Reid hadn't heard her come back in. She had a way of moving through spaces that suggested she had learned somewhere along the way that arriving unannounced told you more than arriving announced. Anonymous application. No covering letter. I filed it in person, Reid said, dropped it off at reception. I know, I checked. She set her own tablet on the table and turned it toward him. On the screen, a scanned handwritten note, brief, on plain paper, with a single line in a handwriting Reid recognized the way you recognized something you'd been trying not to remember. Caldwell-Brent audit vacancy. Thursday morning. Don't let them file it without you there. No name, a date from 6 weeks earlier. Reid read it twice, his hand stayed flat on the table. Where did that come from, he asked. It arrived in our file intake last month, Audra said, attached to a sealed envelope addressed to the CEO's office, marked to be held until the vacancy was posted. We opened it when we posted the role. She paused. The handwriting analysis our legal team ran this afternoon matched the Reid Sorensen memo in our archive. The server room's hum was audible from 2 floors down, or maybe that was just the building settling, or maybe it was just Reid understanding what it meant. Catherine had filed the memo, knowing what she'd found. She had also known, at some level, what might come after finding it. She had left a thread, long enough and patient enough to reach the right moment. He had thought he was chasing the story. He had been following a direction home. The rest of that afternoon moved the way consequential afternoons did. Necessary, uncomfortable, longer than it needed to be, and still not long enough to feel finished. Gareth was escorted from the building by security while 3 lawyers spoke quietly into phones. Donna coordinated with the external forensics team. Audra sat with Reid for 40 minutes going through the original FinTrack file he'd kept, printed, annotated, stored in a fireproof box under Leo's hockey equipment in their Etobicoke basement, that he had thought to bring that morning on a feeling he couldn't have named. At 5:10, Reid walked through the lobby toward the revolving doors. The waiting room on the 32nd floor had long since emptied. The candidates in their expensive blazers had been released hours earlier, assessments suspended pending internal review. Only the city remained outside, Lake Ontario gray and wide and indifferent to what had happened in a server room on the 29th floor. Leo came through the front doors before Reid reached them. He was still in his school sweater, backpack hanging off one shoulder, science fair poster rolled under his arm. He stopped when he saw Reid's jacket. The sleeve was torn at the shoulder seam where it had caught on a server rack corner during the afternoon's less documented moments, and his face did the quick calculation that children performed when they needed to assess whether a parent was okay before they were allowed to ask what happened. "You're ripped," Leo said, pointing at the sleeve. "Jacket's ripped," Reid corrected. Leo considered the distinction. "Are you okay?" Reid crouched down to his level despite the fact that Leo had been telling him for 6 months he was too old for that. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." Leo studied him the way he sometimes did, with that particular seriousness that sat too early in a 10-year-old's face and that Reid recognized as something Leo had inherited from Catherine, the refusal to accept a surface answer. "You sound like the kind of okay that actually means something happened." "It does." "Good something or hard something?" Reid thought about Catherine's handwriting on a piece of paper, about the deletion log, about the name on a 17-page memo that nobody had acted on until today, about Leo leaving drawings on his pillow 6 years ago because pictures helped when words didn't. "Both," he said at the same time. Leo seemed to accept this as a complete answer because he'd grown up in a house where honest complicated was treated as more respectful than easy false. He shifted his poster under his other arm. "Can we still get faux? You said faux if the interview went well." "Interview got extended." "Does that count as going well?" Behind Reid, the elevator doors opened. Audra Mackenzie stepped out into the lobby, coat on, tablet under her arm, moving toward the exit until she saw Reid still kneeling at Leo's height. She stopped. Leo looked at her with the unfiltered evaluation of a child who had not yet learned to soften his assessment into politeness. "Are you the boss?" he asked. Audra looked at Reid briefly, then at Leo, for the moment. "Did my dad help?" She took 1 second longer than she needed to, which was its own kind of answer. "He's the reason we're going to have a very long month ahead of us," she said, "and a better company afterward." She looked at Reid. "Monday at 9, bring the rest of the FinTrack file. We have a lot to rebuild." Reid stood. "I'll be there." She nodded once and moved toward the doors. Leo watched her go. Then he looked at Reid with an expression that was trying very hard not to be pleased with itself and not entirely succeeding. "So faux," he said. Outside, the February light had gone blue and low over the lakefront, the kind of cold that was honest about itself. Reid held the door for his son and felt, in the space between the warm lobby and the cold street, something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. Not the old vigilance, not the patient anger, not the grief that had become so familiar it had started to feel like company. Just the possibility that forward was a direction that led somewhere, and that he had been right to keep walking in it.